listening to Tea with Tolkien, a podcast for the Hobbit at heart. Join us as we chat about the works and faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to carry a little piece of Middle-earth into our own daily lives. Thank you so much for joining us for our 20th and final episode in our Silmarillion read-along series. Thank you so much to everyone who has been a part of our book club this spring. It's been an incredible experience, and I'm so thankful for all of the time and effort everyone put into our discussions. I feel like it was so enriching, and I had a really wonderful time rereading the Silmarillion with all of you. Today we will be discussing the final section of the Silmarillion, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in which these tales come to their end. This section is kind of like the too long didn't read of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and a lot of it is actually depicted quite nicely in the opening of Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring film. So if it feels a little repetitive to you, if you've seen the movie and you've read these books, it feels a little repetitive to me just because I've read them, but I still really enjoyed going through this section. It takes a different perspective than The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is really centered on hobbits, whereas this section really focuses on the Númenóreans and the descendants of the Númenóreans and the era of Isildur and everything like that. So I thought this section was really fun to read, and it really adds a lot to your understanding of The Lord of the Rings. And we are going to be reading The Lord of the Rings together as a group in fall, so this really sets the stage. There are spoilers, but The Lord of the Rings has been out for quite a long time, so if you don't know how it ends already, I don't know what to tell you. Don't listen to this episode, though. Okay. Now that everyone who doesn't want to hear any spoilers has turned off this episode, let's dive into Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. In the beginning of Arda, Sauron was seduced to Melkor's service. When Morgoth, aka Melkor, was overthrown, Sauron repented before Eonwë, who is the herald of Manwë. However, when Eonwë commanded Sauron to come before the Valar for judgment, he refused and was like, I don't want to risk it just in case they make me do a lot of work or I have a long sentence, so instead he just went back to his evil ways. After the War of Wrath, the geography of Beleriand was changed and most of it was now underwater. But one area remained, and this was called Lindon. Many of the Noldor who would not go to the Blessed Realm dwelt in Lindon, including Gil-galad, son of Fingon, and Elrond, half-elven. The elves built the Grey Havens in this area, and they were permitted by the Valar to depart from Middle-earth if they desired. Tolkien writes, For by the mercy of the Valar, the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Erisea and Valinor beyond the encircling seas. Some of the Teleri moved to the realms of the Sylvan Elves in the woods and mountains, and another part of the Noldor dwelt in Eregion, which is also called Hollin, near the west gate of Moria, and there they dwelt in friendship with the dwarves, and they were really into craftsmanship and building stuff and making stuff. In this time, there was a period of peace in Middle-earth. However, Sauron believed that the Valar had once again forgotten about Middle-earth, and he set to work. He wanted to turn the elves and men to his service, but he was more successful with men simply because they are easier to corrupt, and he went by the name Anatar, Lord of Gifts. By this, he concealed his true identity, so nobody knew he was actually Sauron. However, Gil-galad and Elrond were wary of Anatar. They just thought something was up with him, and so they would not permit him into their lands or deal with him at all. Sauron was, however, welcomed by the elves in Eregion, and under his counsel they learned a lot, and they made rings of power. Tolkien writes, But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring. So Sauron intended to use the Rings of Power to control the elves, but once they realized what he was up to, they took off their rings. And in his anger, he came in open war against them and demanded the rings back, since he claimed that they couldn't have made them without him. The elves fled along with 3 of their rings. We have Narya, the ring of fire, which had ruby in it. Nenya, the ring of water, which was set with adamant. And Vilya, the ring of air, which was set with sapphire. These 3 were hidden, and Sauron was unable to find them, and they remained unsullied because Celebrimbor had forged them alone, and Sauron hadn't even touched them. However, they were still under the rule of the One Ring, but they hadn't been, corrupted. After this, war continued between Sauron and the elves, and Eregion was destroyed, Celebrimbor was killed, and Moria was shut. In this time, Imladris, which was also called Rivendell, was founded by Elrond. Now Sauron gave 7 rings to the dwarves and 9 to men. Tolkien writes, and all of those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that had used them. The dwarves did not easily fall under Sauron's control, and they used the rings primarily to gain more wealth, and so in the end, some of these rings were consumed in fire, by dragons or war, and others were recovered by Sauron, but they weren't very useful to him compared to men. Men fell under the dominion of Sauron much more easily. Tolkien writes, men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their days, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable for them. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgul were they, the ringwraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Sauron grew to power and worked towards 3 goals. 1, to become master of all of Middle-earth. 2, to destroy the elves. And 3, to bring about the fall of Númenor. So this section kind of overlaps with Akalabaith. We're still in the middle-ish of the Second Age, and Sauron hasn't come to Númenor yet. As told in Akalabaith, Sauron was then brought to Númenor, where he brought about the destruction of Númenor. And after this, Sauron returned in spirit to Middle-earth, and he was dismayed to see that the power of Gil-galad had grown great in his absence. So while Sauron was busy with Númenor, Gil-galad was busy in Middle-earth, kind of patching things up and trying to make things wholesome again. A small part of the Númenorians survived its destruction. The chief of these were Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion. Elendil came to Lindon, where he befriended Gil-galad, and then he established his realm beyond the Ered Luin, and his chief city was called Anúminas. Isildur and Anarion established their realm in the great land towards the south, and this was called Gondor. The northern kingdom was called Arnor. Minas Ithil was the house of Isildur, and Minas Anor was the house of Anarion, and then they shared Osgiliath. The white tree, grown from the fruit of Nimloth, was planted in Minas Ithil, since Isildur was the one who had saved it. The remainder of the Númenorians also brought with them the Palantiri, the 7 stones, and they were divided amongst the kingdoms. 3 were given to Elendil, and 2 to each of his sons. These stones were used to communicate across distances, and by using them, the Númenorians were able to learn many things about their enemies, as well as just communication with each other. So they were super useful and helpful. And I know in The Lord of the Rings, they are used pretty much only for evil, but these stones didn't begin evil. But we'll have to do a whole nother podcast on the Palantiri, because they're super interesting. As the exiles of Númenor established their realms in Arnor and Gondor, Sauron regained strength in Mordor and built Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. And in that land was the Mountain of Fire called Orodruin, which is later called Mount Doom. Sauron took up a new form since his previous form had been destroyed forever with the fall of Númenor, and he was terrible to behold. So he wasn't able to kind of put on this mask anymore. The only form that he could take was a form of malice and evil, because he had been marred forever. Tolkien writes, he took up again the great ring and clothed himself in power, and the malice of the eye of Sauron, few even of the great among elves and men could endure. In this time Sauron gathered his servants, which included some of the Númenorians that he had swayed to his service. Sauron attacked Minas Ithil and destroyed the White Tree of Isildur, but Isildur escaped with his sons and wife, as well as a seedling from the tree, and they fled seeking Elendil. Anarion held Osgiliath against Sauron for a time and drove him back into the mountains, but he knew that he wouldn't be able to hold him back forever. Elendil and Gil-galad formed a league called the Last Alliance, and together they marched against Sauron. They held Mordor under siege for 7 years, but in this time, unfortunately, Anarion was slain. Finally, Sauron himself came forth and wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil. Both were slain, and the sword of Elendil, called Narsil, broke as he fell. Isildur used the hilt shard of Narsil to cut the one ring from Sauron's finger, defeating him for a time. And thus began the Third Age. So all of that happened in the Second Age of Middle-earth, and now we are moving on to the Third Age. Tolkien writes, "Thus began the Third Age of the world, after the eldest days and the black years, and there was still hope in that time." So after the destruction of Sauron, for the most part, Isildur had a lovely chance to destroy the ring. However, he decided that he would rather keep it. He felt he had earned it, and he felt it was a good recompense for the death of his father and brother. So he would not surrender the One Ring despite the counsel of Elrond and Círdan. Instead, he kept it for himself. Tolkien writes, "They counseled him to cast it into the fire of Orodruin, nigh at hand, in which it had been forged, so that it should perish, and the power of Sauron be forever diminished, and he should remain only as a shadow of malice in the wilderness." But alas, he did not. Isildur returned to Minas Arnor, and he planted the White Tree in memory of his brother. Then he gave the realm of the south to his brother's son, Meneldyl, and he marched north to take up his father's realm. However, he was ambushed along the way and ultimately slain along with most of his people after the ring slipped from his finger into the river. Luckily, he had left his wife and youngest son, Valandil, in Imladris, so his line didn't end. Also note that the shards of Narsil were brought to Isildur's heir in Imladris, so those were not lost either. However, the sword was not remade at the time, because Master Elrond foretold that this would not be done until the ruling ring was found again and Sauron returned. However, everyone hoped that this would never happen. As he grew, Valandil lived in Anúminas, and as the years went on, the men of Westerness became divided and dwindled. So what was once great is kind of just withering away. Eventually, there was nothing left of the great men of Númenor, but a, quote, strange people wandering secretly in the wild. However, the shards of the sword were cherished during many lives of men by the heirs of Isildur, and their line from father to son remained unbroken. So there is still a bit of hope there. The realm of Gondor endured and flourished for a time, but eventually it fell into ruin, as it seems like all things do. In the time of the 23rd king in the line of Meneldyl, Telemnar, a plague came from the east, and the king, his children, and many of the people of Gondor died. Minas Ithil was abandoned, and evil came back once more to the Blackland as the Ringwraiths came to prepare for Sauron's return. In the time of Eärnil, the Ringwraiths came and took Minas Ithil, and it was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery. Osgiliath was then deserted, and Minas Arnor endured, and it was renamed Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard. There they built a white tower, and the White Tree endured before the House of the Kings, so that's nice. Eärnur, son of Eärnil, was the last king of Gondor. He fought in open combat. He went in open combat to Minas Morgul, but he was taken alive, captive into the city and never seen again, and he left no heir. So after this, Gondor was ruled by stewards. Tolkien also mentions that the Rohirrim, the horsemen of the north, came to live in Rohan around that time. Meanwhile, in Imladris, Elrond kept his home as a refuge and as well as a treasury of good counsel and wise lore, is what Tolkien says. The heirs of Isildur were kept safe in Imladris in their youth and old age, and the shards of Narsil were also kept there. During Sauron's reign, the three rings were not used or spoken of. Yet after the fall of Sauron, the rings were used in order to preserve the areas in which the elves held their domain. The Ring of Sapphire was with Elrond in Rivendell, and the Ring of Adamant was with Galadriel in Lothlorien. So the beauty and bliss of these elvish realms were preserved by the power of these rings. However, the elves knew that if Sauron should come again and the One Ring was either found or destroyed, the power of the three rings would end and the elves would have to leave Middle-earth. So after this, Tolkien introduces a forest called Greenwood the Great, but in this time it was called Mirkwood because the darkness of Sauron had come into the forest. As evil spread throughout the forest, Thranduil's people held it at bay in the north. However, they all began to fear this mysterious sorcerer of Dol Guldur, but they didn't realize that, in fact, it was Sauron himself. So they knew something was wrong, but they weren't aware of quite how bad things were. Tolkien writes, even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. So just as this is beginning to happen, the wizards show up. They were sent as messengers from the Valar to contest with Sauron, and they didn't reveal their true names, but they were given different names by different people. We have Mithrandir, who is also called Gandalf. He was closest with the elves and Elrond, and he did not make a home anywhere. Tolkien also writes that he was the most vigilant. Next, we have Curunir, also called Saruman, and he was the oldest, and he went most along with men rather than elves. And he dwelt at Orthanc in Isengard. We also have Radagast, who plays the smallest role in this story, and he was the friend of beasts and birds. Tolkien also writes that there were other Istari that went to the east of Middle-earth, and they are not a part of this story, so he kind of leaves that open-ended. The White Council was called in order to discuss this growing shadow. It included Elrond, Galadriel, Círdan, as well as Gandalf and Saruman. Saruman was the head of the council. Gandalf went to Dol Guldur, and he discovered that the sorcerer was in fact Sauron, and so he returned to Imladris, and the White Council was called. In this time, Gandalf urged the council to act quickly, but Saruman spoke against him, and he wanted everyone to just wait and watch. And so they waited. They didn't realize that Saruman wanted them to wait because he had in secret begun to desire the ring for himself, and so he wanted to delay anyone else from finding it. Tolkien writes, too long had he studied the ways of Sauron in hope to defeat him, and now he envied him as a rival rather than hated his works. Therefore he was willing to play with peril and let Sauron be for a time, hoping by his craft to forestall both his friends and the enemy when the ring should appear. However, after a while, the White Council did agree to drive Sauron from Dol Guldur, and Mirkwood was free from his influence for a time. However, he wasn't actually defeated. It was like a fake out, and he went to Mordor, where the Ringwraiths had been preparing for his coming. Unbeknownst to the wise, though, the ring had been found and was kept hidden. So while this whole time Saruman and Sauron were both looking for the ring wasn't even in the river anymore. It had been found by Gollum, who isn't named in this, but we all know who it is. Tolkien writes, for it had been taken from Anduin long ere they sought for it, being found by one of the small fisher folk that dwelt by the river, ere the kings failed in Gondor, and by its founder it was brought beyond search into dark hiding under the roots of the mountains. After this, it was found again and taken into the land of the Perianath, the little people, the halflings who dwelt in the west of Eriador. Now Mithrandir, Gandalf, first learned of the ring, and with the help of the Dunedain, the remaining men of Westerness, they set a watch on the borders of the land of the Perianath. Eventually, Sauron heard rumor of the ring, and he sent the Nazgul to retrieve it, and war was begun. Tolkien writes, then war was kindled, and in battle with Sauron the Third Age ended even as it had begun. And now we have the War of the Ring. a lot of what happens in the story of the War of the Ring, which can be read in The Lord of the Rings, isn't mentioned here simply because it's in The Lord of the Rings. You can read it there. Tolkien mainly focuses on the story as it relates to the heir of Isildur. So he says that Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, arose, and he took the shards of Narsil reforged, and he went to war with Sauron. There was battle in Rohan, and Saruman the traitor was thrown down, and Isengard was broken. Finally, there was one last hopeless battle before the gates of Mordor. Mithrandir, the sons of Elrond, the king of Rohan, the lords of Gondor, and the heir of Isildur came against the full strength of Sauron, and they would have failed utterly if it were not for Frodo the halfling. And this is where we get our quote of the week. There, at the last, they looked upon death and defeat, and all their valor was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof that which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For as many songs have sung since, it was the Perianath, the little people, dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. Frodo the halfling and his servant had passed into Mordor, and the great ring of power was unmade in the fires from whence it came. Thus the realm of Sauron was ended, and the heir of Isildur was crowned king of Gondor and Arnor, and the white tree flowered again. After the war, it was revealed that Mithrandir had carried the red ring of power. But after the destruction of the One Ring, the power of the Three Rings had faded, and the keepers of the Three Rings left Middle-earth. At this, the age of the elves had come to an end, and the time of men had begun. Tolkien ends this section by writing, in the twilight of autumn it sailed out of Mithlond until the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more, and borne upon the high airs above the mists of the world it passed into the ancient west. And an end was come to the Eldar of story and of song. So with that, we have finished the Silmarillion. Thank you so much, so much. You guys are amazing, and I'm so grateful that this is my job and that I'm able to go through these books with you and just relish in them and talk about Tolkien all day long. I just love it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this book and that these episodes were helpful. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me at Tea with Tolkien on Twitter or Instagram, or by using the contact form on my website, teawithtolkien.com. Stay tuned for some sort of book club grand finale celebration. I'm sure I'll be posting about it on social media soon, so make sure to follow me over there. I wanted to do something just to celebrate the end of this book club because it's been so wonderful, and I appreciate everyone who's participated. So with that, I am going to be taking a break for the summer. We will be coming back in September with our Lord of the Rings read-along. I won't be doing weekly episodes for those, though. We'll just be doing once a month book club episodes, as well as hopefully some other, regular podcasting content. So I hope you all have a wonderful summer, and if you would like to connect or hang out, I will be on social media, and who knows, I might be able to get a couple podcasts out during the summer, but I'm really excited to spend some more time with my family. So I will see you all at some point, and I hope you have a wonderful period of time until I talk to you again.